an area, into a prospect, you generally have a test well, and it's to test the idea. We think there's oil down there, so you want to find out, is there oil, and can we get it out in commercial quantities? And for this area, we had decided to drill 3 test wells. The Collier-Hogan is the first test well. We've been unable to drill our other 2 test wells, so from the Collier-Hogan well, the results are extremely promising.
Okay. Can you be specific in terms of how much productivity?
Well, we can't do it without doing further testing, which is why we needed the other 2 wells. But the results were very promising.
From your perspective?
From our perspective, we have a valid operating permit. We turned in a notice for workover operation, well over a 24-hour notice, which is what's required by law. We answered every question that the DEP gave us. They never stated any concerns about the actual procedure. They had an inspector on the location the entire time that we were doing the stimulation. They knew exactly when we started. They knew that we were going to start. I know that
Did the inspector say anything, or while you were doing this procedure, like, hey, we shouldn't be doing this, or did they say anything at all that showed that the DEP was unhappy with what you were doing?
Well, we had conversations with DEP, but they never, anytime we said, well, what is the problem here? What law are we violating? What are your concerns? They didn't have an answer.
They didn't answer anything? I mean, they didn't say, don't do this or do that, or?
Well, once we got, when we got the cease and desist, we knew.
But before that, you didn't know what it was?
We don't have a clue why they didn't want us to. Like I said, we answered every single question.
Was it the fact that there was a prop put in there, and the fact that it was what we've been calling an unauthorized fracking-like method? Other people have called it fracking, but
that was never addressed to Hughes. That was never brought up to us. And I know that in an interview with you, Secretary Vineyard actually said that the cease and desist was the first cease and desist that he personally signed. And that his reason for doing so was a list of questions was submitted to Hughes that went unanswered. After I saw that, the truth is there was no list of questions that was submitted to Hughes. After we saw the interview, I actually wrote a letter to Secretary Vineyard telling him that there was no list, and we additionally filed a 119 request for public records request.
I have that, yes.
Asking for that list, and DEP has not produced it. We want them to either show us the list or admit that it never in fact existed. And we know that the review for that has been completed, and they haven't given us any results in writing. So that was one of the writs that we filed last week.
Yes. And when you say cleanest, what do you mean by that?
No spills, no fluid that there isn't any contamination, anything like that.
Well, I know that there were certain things. We took aerial photographs, and other people did as well. And I know that there were some spills. The DEP's talked about some spills. Now they said it was underneath the reporting level, but there was talk of at least 2 barrels of oil.
Yeah, but that's a true spill is something that it's soaked into the soil profile, and it's not, it's an area that's contaminated. This area is, everything that you saw was surface contamination that's been taken care of and certified as clean.
Used on the really dangerous carcinogenic chemicals, are the ones that we don't know anything about. What's your response to that?
Well, first of all, you have to understand that with or without that stimulation, the well is constructed so that whatever we put in the well stays in the well. Because even if we didn't have that stimulation, even if those chemicals hadn't been used, you want to make sure that the petroleum, anything else, that when we acidized, which didn't create any sort of concern, you have to make sure that stays in the well too. So we know that it is safe.
There's 4 sets of casing, and it starts out with a 36-inch conductor casing, which goes down a couple hundred feet. Then you have your surface casing, which continues going down within the conductor casing. Then you have an intermediate casing that goes all the way down to the production zone. Then you have production casing.
So how many casings are there?
There's 4.
4 casings.
And the surface casing and the intermediate casing all have cement around them.
It's an injection area. everybody in Florida injects into the boulder zone. So, I mean, that is case with, it has a layer of anhydrite above it and below it. And that's what keeps everything right there. And as you can see, I mean, there are...
So 30 anhydrite layers before you even get to the boulder zone.
And the aquifers are where in this?
The aquifers are way up here. The USDW is at about 1,800 feet. The superficial aquifer goes down to about 100. Most of the domestic wells out here are around 30 feet.
So
Well, let me actually
Sure.
say, from here, we drilled horizontally in here, so the idea of it percolating up, traveling up 2 miles, which just, so you know, this is 2 miles below the USDW, is not going to happen. You have all these impermeable layers, which is actually what encases the oil down there. Because you need that pressure to make oil or gas, and if it could percolate up, it wouldn't actually be there anymore.
You're terminating your leases here in Southwest Florida. I mean, are you done with Florida in general, or would you drill in somewhere else in the state, or would think about it?
I don't ever want to say that we're done with the state of Florida. We think that the state has a lot to offer, a lot of potential, and we are extremely, I mean, it is an understatement to say how disappointed we are with the behavior of the DEP recently. But for the moment, we are pulling out of this area. Well, first of all, the hydrogen sulfide is not a real threat here. We, had an administrative hearing over it where we had, tons of experts testify. Up in North Florida, where the J field is, hydrogen sulfide is a serious issue. So you have to have an H2S contingency plan, and you have to, you definitely have to account for that. And there's just a state rule that said, you should really have, they wanted us to have a contingency plan, so we did it. There was no H2S here. There's no H2S down near Golden Gate Estates. And there is actually a very sufficient H2S contingency plan, even if it were encountered, which nobody expects it to be.
Is there one for here too, as well as the...
There is one here, and that was fine, and it was all handled exactly the same way, and there is an H2S contingency plan prior to drilling. It's part of our application, and after having drilled it, no H2S was ever detected.
In terms of threats to the groundwater supply, the fact that this is porous rock?
Well, again...
She just showed you 30 layers of impermeable material.
You do know about the production. How long do you think that this would be
this
in operation?
Similar to a well that Exxon drilled near here, and it is following that sort of curve. And that well, I think, produced for 30 years.
Oh.
Removing a substance, is there any procedure that injects anything to support?
No, but I mean, you're talking 2 miles below the surface. There's not going to be a sinkhole or a collapse or...
It's not an open void. It's porous areas. This porous rock that you keep talking about, that's what's within the oil trend, the formation. It's not just an open gaping hole. It's actual porous rock that the oil flows through.
To produce an oil reservoir, you have to have the rock has to have 2 things: porosity and permeability. And the porosity is little holes in it, that's what captures the oil, but you have to have permeability, which are pathways that connect all those holes together. And so all you're doing is draining these tiny little areas. I mean, think of it like a sponge, kind of. So, I mean, even though you drain the oil, the rest of it still remains in place. So it's not going to make a giant cave underground, 2 miles underground.
How about earthquakes? That's something that's certainly, other sites in the country, it's been a real concern. For example, Oklahoma has now become one of the centers of earthquake production in the country since it's had so much drilling and fracking going on.
I can address that.
Okay.
There have been a couple studies, one by the USGS, the United States Geological Survey, one by the University of Texas, both that were issued late last year, that did at least tentatively, they think, establish some connection between disposal wells and minor earthquake activity in some parts of the country. And it was really linked to a handful of disposal wells that were improperly managed and not sited correctly. This well does not involve a disposal well. The water's being trucked off the site. So
Was that? But what was done here was not, just to be clear, was not hydraulic fracturing.
Right, not like you're seeing over in Texas and North Dakota. This was an acid job.
Is that something about, I know certainly people can care about the wildlife, is that something, you know, that wildlife you need to protect the wildlife from if you're venting gas?
No, I mean, it just
Panther
dissipates
wanders through?
No, I mean, it dissipates very quickly. If it were anything more than that, you would, the wildlife still wouldn't have an issue, but we would have to do things differently. You know, DEP regulates that, obviously. But the wildlife, it doesn't really affect them. I mean, they're not going to...
And Ryan and crews and people are here.
Yeah,
on the pad
we're
when it's
working
happening.
within 2-3 feet of the wellhead, so it's not usually an issue.
And actually, up until very recently, we had housing out here. We had trailers out here, so we had people actually staying out here all the time, monitoring the well, watching it, being in. You know, we had people in charge, making sure that everything went okay. And then the crew changes; they do shift changes, and that's just a few pickup trucks and things like that. So, but it's definitely not hundreds of people, but I mean, yeah, you could have 50 people.
We did a study several years ago. The industry did. But this was 5 or 6 years ago, that associated about 55 jobs for each drilling rig in the country.
So I believe in Texas it's
300
feet.
300 feet.
That's the setback rule for, statewide rule for drilling a well. That's the minimum distance from a well drilling to an occupied residence. Occupied, they call it a dwelling. The most restrictive regulation in the country is in West Virginia. That's 550 feet.
Not only that, but there's not H2S here. If there was H2S here, there's not pressure downhole. So, the Hollywood picture that everyone has of a blowout with oil going everywhere, that doesn't happen here, couldn't happen here, because there's not pressure. That's why we're actually having to pump it out.
Yeah, without that pump, the oil will not flow to the surface.
So if there was H2S, there's no dispersion method, even if there was.